welcome to the KKT show. Only the hard sciences can give us a true and an accurate depiction of reality. Only that which is testable by science is true. That is the fundamental idea behind scientism, and that's the first part of our title done. The other part is Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Now that's an awesome anime, and even if you're not an anime aficionado, I'd recommend that you watch that. Hiromu Arakawa, the mangaka, does an excellent job in treating a whole range of issues. We're not going to delve into any of that, but she also focuses on scientism and the logical conclusions of that particular view, which, spoiler alert, leads to death, destruction, and absolute chaos. A good note to start with, I guess. Well, that's that. Professor J.P. Moreland, he is the Dr. J.P. Moreland, is a professor of philosophy at Biola University. He has this to say about scientism, and I paraphrase: a building is only as strong as its foundations, and science is only as certain as its presuppositions. So what are the presuppositions of science? Well, basically it's fundamental ideas, right? The fundamental assumptions that are required for us to do any sort of scientific experiment. What are those? Well, he lists quite a few of them. I'm not going to go into detail in any of that. If you would wish to go into more detail, there is his book, Scientism and Secularism. Awesome. I'd recommend you check it out. Alright, so one or two of them. The fact that objective truths exist. Well, that ought to be self-evident, but in our culture where your truth is prevalent, not so much. So the idea is truth exists outside of human minds, that it is independent of human minds, right? Objective truth exists. Number two, the fact that there is uniformity in nature, something that Hume observed quite a while ago, and which also cannot be proved by science, and yet is a fundamental necessity for any sort of scientific experiment to work. The fact that the laws of logic and the laws of mathematics exist. These are a priori fields, and, well, science acquires them, and they cannot be proven by science. The fact that moral values and odds exist. All of these are fundamental assumptions, and science cannot prove them, but it rests on them. So, the statement that I mentioned before, only that which is testable by science is true, well, it's like, as J.P. Moreland says, it is self-refuting. But the fact that it is philosophically self-refuting doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to stop following it, because a whole lot of people do find that philosophy to be extremely appealing and are guided by it, which has resulted in quite a serious number of issues. But let's deal with how Hiromu Arakawa does deal with scientism in her awesome work, right? So, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is this fantastic anime wherein we have two protagonists. We have Edward and Alphonse. So Ed and Al, these are our boys. They start off with having committed taboo. A taboo in which they perform human transmutation. We're not going to delve into that. The fact is they did something wrong and they had to pay for it. And they paid for it by, well, one brother losing his arm and his leg, and the other brother losing his entire body. Now they're on this journey to get this fixed, right? And that's it. Now, the whole setting is extremely reminiscent, or the fact is, it is deliberately meant to parallel certain aspects of the Second World War. We've got people that are quite similar to Hitler. We've got Führer Bradley. We've got the Nazi extermination of Jewry being paralleled in the Schwallen War of Extermination, and so on and so forth. There are quite a few parallels that enable us to, well, draw the lines. And what is even more fascinating is that alchemy can be compared to science in the real world. So what alchemists are in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood would be what scientists are in our world, right? So our brothers move on, and they meet this man called Father Cornello. Now he's a priest, and he's got all the garb, of a priest with his long black robe and stuff, and he stands there and he uses a philosopher's stone and uses that to, well, perform tricks and sway the minds of the gullible village folk. So they follow his teachings, and he acts as though he's the representative of God himself, the sun god Leto in that particular example. And the brothers show that all he's doing is using alchemy and producing magic tricks, which are nothing more than that. And they use it to prove that he's a charlatan and a fraud. So the outlook is clear from the start. The secular outlook seems to be the one that is pushed forth, right? So secular outlook, yay, science, yay, religion and faith, boo. But as they move forward, they realize that it's not quite as simple as that, because as the brothers move on, as they journey on, they encounter people, they meet people who, well, to put it mildly, are driven by boundless ambition, devoid of all compunction, commit horrible atrocities in the name of progress. Now we have parallels to that, right? They use alchemy for progress, and in the Nazi war, in the Third Reich, they used science for progress. The Nazi warmongers, when we call them, were in fact part of the Nazi Germany, which was the most sophisticated and intellectually advanced society of that time. And as Richard Weikart notes, Nazism was motivated by an ethic that prided itself on being scientific. That was the idea. I mean, they were scientific, and they knew that. Dr. David Berlinski knows this. A generation of German biologists concluded that the competition between species was reflected in human affairs by competition between the races. And it's not a stretch to think that really happened, because consider the title of Darwin's great book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, it's really not a stretch to imagine that title giving rise to some questionable ideas, namely that of social Darwinism. Now, this has been discussed quite a lot by a huge number of people, and we're not going to delve too deep into it. But it's basically the view that evolutionary processes in natural history have parallels in social history. This is done by applying the biological concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest to sociology, economics, and politics. Now, the credit for this view does not exactly go to Darwin, but to quite a number of others, like Herbert Spencer, Thomas Malthus, Francis Galton, to name a few. It is said that this term, social Darwinism, was coined by Thomas Huxley. Regardless of those who coined the term or those who promulgated these views, the idea is this view resulted in eugenics and the genocidal policies of the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. Now, let me make it clear, you do not judge a philosophy by its abuse. So I'm not judging Darwinism or the theory of evolution based on this fact, based on the fact that it may have been used by the Nazi warmongers for their despicable ends. No. Whether or not Darwin's theory could have resulted in these views as a natural consequence is a topic for another day. The fact is, the issue of scientism, the problem of scientism, that a highly advanced society like Germany could have used science as a means to absolutely despicable and horrific ends. That is the question here. That is the issue here. So what gives? What was going on? Why wasn't science enough? To come back to Fullmetal Alchemist, why wasn't alchemy enough? Well, it's pretty simple. There is no moral framework. If you're practicing science without any moral tether of any sort, then anything goes, and it's not going to end, well, good for anyone concerned, because if you're practicing this and all you have in your mind is some vague idea of progress with no idea of how to justify the presuppositions of science or a moral framework to do this in, you end up with what we just mentioned before, scientism, and the results are obvious. Right. So what happens in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood? The brothers realize that the Ishvalan War of Extermination was not just some civil war, but that it was a part of a huge plan in the nationwide transmutation circle, so that the elite could sacrifice the common for the progress of humanity, and they considered humanity to be the uber elite. Again, the parallels are extremely similar to the Übermensch idea in Nazism, or the fact that Hitler borrowed the idea of Übermensch from Friedrich Nietzsche. Hiromu Arakawa does an excellent job in taking the parallels and showing us what's going on. But there is this one scene in particular that I want us to focus on, which was when General Raven and Olivia Mira Armstrong, the Northern Wall of Bricks, the Ice Queen herself were talking. And that scene gives us extremely well what is going on in the minds of these people. General Raven says this, and he says, the inferior have to die for the good of their betters. And that's the basic idea of all of this. He stands there, face to face, with Olivia Mira Armstrong, looks her in the face and says this, well, so long as humanity can progress, so long as the elites can rule the world, it's alright if we make the inferior suffer. Who decides any of that? Well, it's the urban elite. It's the supermen. And that is what scientism led to. Now you might say, oh, hold your horses. That's not what scientism, that's because a few crazy men decided to go berserk. Well, not exactly. Because their idea was pretty clear, right? Only the hard sciences is the way to absolute truth. There is no moral framework. So let's move forward with this. Let's move forward this because this is progress. Competition between species is reflected in competition between the races, and the superior race has to emerge for humanity to progress. It's not far-fetched at all. And that's precisely what happened. The Ishwalan War of Extermination, the nationwide transmutation cycle, all of these point to how society used science, to how the Society and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood used science as a means to absolutely gore the ends. So what does this tell the 21st century intellectual? The man who considers himself, well, pretty smart, to put it lightly. The fact is, while scientific progress is absolutely wonderful, it cannot be done in a vacuum. You do not do science in a vacuum. You do it with the understanding that the presuppositions of science have to be based on something. That the abstract concepts we mentioned before, the fact that the laws of logic exist, that the laws of mathematics exist, that objective truth exists, that there is a moral framework to all of this. You cannot justify that on any sort of naturalistic grounds. But that is precisely what modern scientism claims it can. Our modern day urban youth would say that we don't just follow methodological naturalism in our scientific research and study, we follow metaphysical naturalism, the fact that nothing exists outside of nature. Now that is metaphysical naturalism, and that is extremely connected with scientism. And that is a horrible idea, one which has led to destruction and chaos, and will inevitably lead to those gory ends if we're not careful. The fact is, the unchanging laws of logic, the moral values and odds, objective truth, none of this can exist in a naturalistic framework. They can only be grounded in a transcendent creator who created this and is himself unchanging, immaterial, and immortal. That is the only way you can ground any of this. So appreciation for the scientific works and scientific merit and the scientific method is fantastic. But to do that in a vacuum is misguided. But to do that within the framework of a creator, of a transcendent God, who allows for the orderliness in nature, who allows for us to be able to understand this, who allows for the uniformity in nature, so that man can experience this and analyze this. Now that is something amazing. And when seen within that framework, science makes sense and progress has meaning. Well, I hope this was informative, and I hope you guys have had fun. I'm Kiran, and I hope you'll at least watch Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood after this. If you found this content interesting, consider liking and sharing this video, and subscribing to the KKT Show. I'll see you all again next time.